Census 2010. Let's take a detour and just quickly cover the main results of Census 2010. That is our most recent population census. Here's an image taken from the Census Bureau that shows the United States and the different areas of the different states and the change in population from the year 2000 to 2010. And as you can see by the darker colors, most of the growth in the country occurred in the South, Florida through North Carolina, in Texas, and good old Las Vegas and Nevada, and the mountain states. On the right-hand side are the breakouts of the national population in 2010 by the major race categories and whether or not the population is of Hispanic or Latino origin. Now, those categories and whether you're Hispanic and what it means to be Hispanic, all defined by the Census Bureau, but self-identified. People themselves identify which of these groups they're in. But these categories of race are essentially created by the Census Bureau, and everybody uses them to be consistent across the country. Here is a slide showing the change in population between 2000 and 2010 on the far right compared to the last 5 decades from 1950 through 2000. Look at that. Population growth was actually lower in the last 10 years compared to 1990 and 2000, and percentage-wise, one of the lowest since 1950. That was sort of unexpected. But again, the population of the country is 308,745,000. That was in 2010. The population of the country is growing by about 2.5 million people a year. And at the time I'm recording this course, the population was about 315 million. What does 2.5 million people a year mean? That's the city of Chicago. That's the city of Chicago being spread out across the country every year, year after year after year. On this next slide, I'm presenting some findings from the Brookings Institute. Brookings is a think tank in Washington, D.C., and they put together these 5 major findings from Census 2010. And I won't read every word on here, you can read those. But basically, as I said before, the United States is growing more slowly. There across the slide you have the percent growth in percent by decade going all the way back to the 1930s when we had a depression. And you can see all through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even all the way through the 90s, the percentage of growth was larger than the last 10 years. This has been then the slowest decade of population and the growth in the United States in the past 70 years. Number 2, Americans are increasingly stuck at home. Another historic demographic lull in the 2000s is the number of people moving. Usually people move every 7 or 8 years, but we think largely because of the recession from 2008, 2009, and so on, that fewer people could afford to move, or they just couldn't or didn't want to, and Americans are moving less than they historically have, as you can see from this chart. Number 3, minorities, or again, the definition of minority being largely anyone who is non-white and non-Hispanic, is what's driving growth in the country. America's youth are largely of minorities of one kind or another. Here you can see again in these pie charts from the 1950s the percentage of growth that is a minority share of the growth, as 92% is the highest it's ever been in the 2000s. Number 4, us baby boomers are continuing to age. Now remember, the baby boom is the post-World War II generation, born between 1946 and 1964. And we were the ones who brought you the Beatles and all kinds of good and bad things, and we are still continuing to drive the economy of the country in many ways, and now it's healthcare as we get old. So the rest of you are just kind of dragged along by the aging of the baby boom. And here you can see the continuing aging of the population relative to the entire population. And finally, number 5, Americans as a whole lost ground on income and poverty went up in the period between 2000 and 2010. On the left-hand side, you can see real median household income in 2010 in standardized dollars going back to 1970. So, from 1970 to 2010, sure, there's been some growth, but roughly from 1990 to 2010, it's been pretty flat. That is a median household income across the entire population. Obviously, some people did far worse and many did better. On the right-hand side is the percent change in median household income by decade, 1970s to 2000. And here again, you see for the first time in 40 years, median income actually declined in standard dollars by almost 9%. That is pretty phenomenal. And further down, you can read that the share of people living in poverty was up to 15%, the highest level since 1993. Now, hopefully, as the economy gets better, these numbers will change, and they really reflect a rather unfortunate 5-year period in American economic history from 2008 to roughly 2012. How do we know all this about economics as well as population? And that brings me to a related topic, and that's the economic censuses. Just like there's a population and housing census, the Census Bureau conducts every 5 years a whole series of economic censuses. Now remember that slide on taking a census. It starts off with every address. And again, here we do the same thing. Every business address is in the master address file for that particular sector of the economy. Look on the right-hand side and you can see the different sectors of the economy that are classified and broken out according to what's called the North American Industry Classification System. Multi-sector, mining, utilities, construction, manufacturing, wholesale trade, retail trade, transportation, finance, real estate, accommodations and food services, and so on. There's also a census of governments, types of governments throughout the country. There's a lot of governments in the United States. We have over 3,000 counties, 40,000 cities, and when you add up all the special districts like school districts, it's a huge number. Talking about surveys then, how do you take a survey? Well, like I said before, you have to have this address list from a last census, whether it's a population census, a housing, or an economic census. You have to have what's called a sampling frame. That's all the addresses. Each of those addresses is tied to a specific latitude and longitude point on a map, a digital map of the country, and like the post office, represents a real place on the surface of the earth. From that address list, you draw a sample. That has to be a random sample. Sometimes you correct for certain population groups because they're relatively small and you want to get a good number for them, so you increase the sample size, say for a minority group or a certain kind of business, so that the numbers will be good. You mail out your questionnaires, the returns are processed, and just like a census, if someone doesn't return a document, you try to contact them during non-response follow-up. That largely occurs from the 6 census offices scattered across the country. The data are processed and evaluated, and now in a sample you have weighting. Each response is multiplied by 9 or 10 or 20 or something to weight the sample data up to the total. There's also suppression to maintain confidentiality of the respondents. Suppression means data won't be published if it could lead to identifying an actual respondent, whether it's a business or a person. The data are tabulated, evaluated as to quality, and published. And once again, you are coming in at the bottom of this list. You're going after the published data. There are many surveys. Here are a list of the big ones. These are the surveys that are kind of the rooms, if you will, in that big house of statistical architecture. One of the granddaddies is the Current Population Survey. That survey produces the monthly unemployment statistics that come out on the first Friday of every month. And as you know, they get reported far and wide and can make or break a presidential campaign and so forth. an important number. Wall Street can go up and down based on those numbers. The American Housing Survey produces reams of data about the quality and size of American houses and which markets are doing what and values and rents. Survey of Income and Program Participation is a very detailed survey about income, focused largely on poverty and persons of low and moderate income. The rest you can kind of figure out: the crime survey, the health interview survey. Consumer expenditure is very important. That's the one that produces inflation. That CPI index that you're looking for every year for a raise comes out of the Consumer Expenditure Survey. American Community Survey is another major survey that is now providing an enormous amount of data that we're going to look at in FactFinder. Back at the beginning of the course, I talked about a camera and a movie camera. And the American Community Survey is the movie camera. It's producing data every year that's only a year old for the entire country. We're going to focus a lot of that in the third course. And finally, there's a slew of monthly economic sector surveys, such as housing starts, new construction, that are again watched and reported extensively in the news, in the media, and by economists and investors and so on. We've come to the end of Chapter 4. See you in Chapter 5.